Hello readers, I'm David Reader and today I'm reviewing The Loom of Time, written by Robert Kaplan in 2023. So this is Robert Kaplan's most recent book. It's a geopolitics book about the Greater Middle East. So the subtitle is Between Empire and Anarchy, from the Mediterranean to China. So this book in a sense builds upon Robert Kaplan's previous books, and the concept of this book, The Loom of Time, is that you have progress. It's just that it's incrementally takes time, but there's real progress that we're actually seeing in the Greater Middle East overall. And the Greater Middle East goes from Greece up to Central Asia, Xinjiang, down all the way to Ethiopia. So it's a very big geographic region, much bigger than the traditional Middle East we talk about. And in this book there are sections on Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Fertile Crescent, which is Greater Syria and Iraq, Iran and Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia. And this is not just geopolitics. Robert Kaplan does give some historical background and also does give some background on the civilizational cultural debates. So Robert Kaplan talks about, among other things, Edward Gibbon's decline and fall of the Roman Empire, specifically focusing on the Byzantine part. He talks about Toynbee Civilizations series. He talks about Edward Said's Orientalism. He talks about Clifford Gates and anthropology. He talks about thick description, I think it's called. So yeah, it's a very broad book on the region of the Greater Middle East, although it's mainly focusing on the geopolitics of the region since the late Ottoman Empire. And the general theme in this book is finding the balance between tyranny and anarchy. Kaplan argues that empires such as the Habsburg and Ottoman empires were much better at protecting minority rights than the nation states that emerged that were supposed to be democratic but turned into anarchic violence. One criticism I will levy in this book, Kaplan plays a bit loose with a couple of concepts. There's a part of this book, for example, where Robert Kaplan says that in traditional monarchies like Morocco, Jordan, and Oman, civil liberties are respected, but then he's using a very narrow definition of civil liberties. I mean, yeah, Morocco is relatively free. They're not really, but they're partially free at least. Civil liberties are kind of respected there. But Jordan and Oman, no. In Oman, for example, apostasy is illegal, so you're not executed like in some places. But if you question the validity of religion on an online forum in Oman, you get arrested. So no, it's not true that civil liberties are respected. Civil liberties are better respected in the Islamic republics or in some other Muslim countries. But Kaplan exaggerates a bit, and he also romanticizes a bunch of stuff here. So he argues for cultural relativism in a sense by saying that the scenario of how things are operating in different places makes sense in their context. He kind of ignores universality in parts of this book. So Robert Kaplan is usually a moderate neo-realist, which is good. It brings a lot of balance against idealists, and overall he maintains a good balance in this book, but sometimes he veers too much into realism and determinism. So let's get into the different countries. One of the countries that Robert Kaplan talks about is Turkey, and here he argues that Westernization went too far under Ataturk, which led to a backlash among Muslims, and he argues basically with urbanization, people are uprooted from their traditional societies, which leads to Islam becoming more radical among these people. So actually the new urban middle class in places like Ankara in Turkey actually support Erdogan, who's kind of an Islamist and an autocrat. And in Turkey you actually have a really strong cancel culture, so there's strong self-censorship. So you have had purges of places like the military, police, the media, journalism and universities, and Erdogan has destroyed Turkey's institutions. There's no rule of law now. However, Kaplan thinks that it's likely that democracy will dislodge Erdogan, because that actually happened in Turkey previously in the 1950s with another autocrat. Next, Robert Kaplan talks about Egypt, and here the thing we forget is that actually Egypt under late British imperial rule, so when they were semi-independent, so from the 1920s to 1950s, they actually had an experiment with quasi-liberal democracy. So you had elections that were mostly democratic, you had a free press, but it was relatively chaotic. And the coup by Gamal Nasser in 1952, I think, Nasser's charisma actually destroyed what little civil society that Egypt had previously. And the thing with Egypt, you only have two institutions really. You have the military, which runs the economy, and you have the Muslim Brotherhood. So the problem is that if you have democratization in Egypt, you're just gonna have election of the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamists, which will make civil liberties, ironically, in Egypt worse than what they would be under a military dictatorship, and it would also be far more chaotic. So when you had the Arab Spring in 2011, they elected in 2012 a Muslim Brotherhood man, Mohammed Morsi, and this led to anarchy in Egypt, and he was on the point, I think, of screwing around with the Coptic Christian minority in Egypt, which makes up about 10% of Egypt's population, which led to a coup in Egypt with the military man Sisi in power now since 2013, who is more modernist than Mubarak, who was before him, but also more repressive. And Nasser died a broken man in 1970 because he lost a war against Israel in 1967, and he was replaced by Anwar Sadat, who was a visionist, a reformer, and that guy was in power from 1970 to 1981, so he participated in the Yom Kippur War against Israel in 1973, but then he was diplomatic with Israel, so he got back the Sinai Peninsula. He also kind of liberalized the Egyptian economy and also politically a bit, so the Muslim Brotherhood was less repressed. Ironically, this led to him getting assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood in 1981. He was replaced by Mubarak, whose stated goal was just to remain in power and die in his bed so that he doesn't get murdered like Sadat. This led to his rule being kind of alright in the first 10 years, but then it decayed over time and the Egyptian economy just stagnated. Now we've had Sisi in power in Egypt for about 10 years, and he's been trying to modernizing the Egyptian economy. And the thing with Egypt is that you have the elite that's secular, but the vast majority of Egyptians are religious Muslims. But the thing is that with Sisi's modernization and economic growth, it's actually a lot weaker than it looks. So a lot of the economic growth in Egypt is based just off population growth, and the rest is basically based off government spending. So it's no real sustainable economic growth. So yeah, Egypt is not in a good situation economically. And if Sisi remains in power several decades like Mubarak did, it's likely that his rule is gonna decay in the coming decades that he's in power. But at least Sisi respects the rights of the Coptic Christian community. And the thing is, for Egypt to develop, the military needs to loosen its grip on the economy and on civil society and all that, but the military is unwilling to do that. So Egypt is likely to stagnate and they have population growth problems. So yeah, Egypt's prospects are not that good. Next, Robert Kaplan talks about Ethiopia. He says basically it's an empire. So first you had the official empire, which was a feudal system under Haile Selassie until the 1970s, which Kaplan argues feudalism was kind of beneficial, which is weird, but sure, it was better than what you had succeeding it. So after Haile Selassie, you had the Derg coup by the Marxist Mengistu in 1974, who ruled until 1991. And here Kaplan actually draws in this book on parallels between different countries. So there's a parallel between Mengistu's rule and the rule under Lenin and Stalin. So you had the same type of famine in the 1980s in Ethiopia that you had in the 1930s in Ukraine, and it was actually orchestrated in the same way by Marxists. This was not a natural famine. This was a government orchestrated one. The succeeding dictator in Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, decentralized Ethiopia, so it was relatively stable, and he also made peace with Eritrea. But now we've had in the last few years the rule of Abiy Ahmed, which has kind of democratized and liberalized Ethiopia. However, the problem is that he's trying to centralize it, which paradoxically has led to more anarchy. So he started a war in Tigray, which went on for a couple of years. Ethiopia is a makeup of many different ethnicities, and the Tigray have been a dominant source of power in the Ethiopian bureaucracy. Yeah, that has destabilized the Ethiopia a lot. Plus, Abiy Ahmed aligned himself with the totalitarian dictator in Eritrea, Afwerki, who fought against Tigray, who the Tigrays hate. And the thing is that Ethiopia cannot successfully operate as a centralized state. So Ethiopia is kind of an empire, but it needs to be decentralized to work with all the different ethnic groups, Amharas, Oromos, and Tigrays. Next, Robert Kaplan talks about Saudi Arabia. And as I've talked in many previous book reviews, Saudi Arabia is actually going under a process of reform now. So the rule of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, has been dynamic, consultative, and reformist modernization. MBS consults with a variety of people to modernize the Saudi economy, and there's actually been quite a lot of liberalization in Saudi Arabia, and Kaplan draws on a very good distinction here between democratization and liberalization. So some places in the Arab world, the Gulf monarchies especially, have liberalized kind of in recent years. So you have more civil liberties now, the rights of women have improved, especially in Saudi Arabia, and society in Saudi Arabia now is far less Islamic than it was 10 years ago. However, the monarchies will still maintain power. And in Saudi Arabia, you have the division between three sectors. So you have the cosmopolitan holy Hejaz, so the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, who are on the west Saudi coast in the Red Sea, which makes them culturally more cosmopolitan. Then you have the conservative middle plateau, Najd, where you have all the Islamic fundamentalists. And then you have the east of Saudi Arabia, which is where they have all the oil, but which is Shiites. Kaplan talks about how everyone basically sees Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore as a political model to emulate. Although there's one little digression, nitpick that Kaplan makes in this book where, there was a democracy summit by Biden recently, and among the countries he invited was Democratic Republic of Congo, but he did not invite Singapore, which it is true that democracy is not necessarily the first goal that should be for different developing countries. They should be focusing on institutions and economic development and wise rule before they democratize. But still, this nitpick by Kaplan of a democracy summit inviting the Democratic Republic of Congo but not Singapore, well, that's because the Democratic Republic of Congo, although it's a very weak and unstable democracy, it's still a democracy. Singapore is a dictatorship. So if you have a democracy summit, you will invite all the democracies, even the weak, bad ones. You won't invite the dictatorships, even the ones that are relatively benevolent, like Singapore. Next, Robert Kaplan spends 3 chapters on the Fertile Crescent region, which is Greater Syria and Iraq, and he talks about the geography and how you have natural boundaries, but they do not reflect the political geographies of Iraq and Syria. And the concept of Greater Syria, by the way, includes Lebanon and Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And these political geographies, because they're so unnatural, Kaplan argues that they necessitate authoritarian centralization for order. And because Iraq's geography is more unnatural than Syria's, that's why you had a more repressive regime under Saddam Hussein than under Hafez al-Assad, even though they were both Ba'athist socialist regimes with Arab nationalism. Robert Kaplan talks about here how under Hafez al-Assad you had relative stability in Syria between 1970 and 2000, and that Hafez al-Assad was a realist, so he operated within the political reality that existed. He maintained a good balance, so he did use some strong repression, sometimes killing, I think, once 20,000 people, but he never went nuts, really. But then you had his successor, Bashar al-Assad, which kind of opened up a little bit Syria, and then that spiraled into civil war. And then you have Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which has more unnatural borders and ethnic groups being mixed together, which Kaplan kind of argues necessitated Saddam Hussein's totalitarianism and brutality. And Saddam Hussein was just brutal, cruel, in an unreasonable way. So Kaplan talks about his mistake here of supporting the Iraq war. And the reason was that Kaplan in this book, he's visited a lot of different countries. He talks with a bunch of different people, and he's historically been a journalist who's traveled around the world. So he's visited most countries around the world. So he's visited Syria, for example, several times, but he's also visited Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Kaplan witnessed firsthand the totalitarianism in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the feeling of oppression, and he hated it so much, which was why he supported the Iraq war, because he just wanted to remove Saddam Hussein's regime, because he thought that anything would be better than Saddam Hussein. Now, of course, Saddam Hussein was extremely cruel. He also did the Anfal campaign in the late 1980s, which killed tens of thousands of Kurds. But of course, Kaplan regrets his decision of supporting the Iraq war because soon after Saddam Hussein was toppled, you had more anarchy and arguably more deaths resulting from the Iraqi civil wars than what you had under Saddam Hussein. Kaplan, in a sense, prefers order, even if it's tyrannical, to anarchy, because in anarchy you can have no economic growth, you cannot have secure property rights. People's existence is basically precarious. Even in tyranny, usually, it's less precarious. And then Kaplan talks about the Kurds and how they basically thrive in the anarchy, so-called, that is occurring in the Fertile Crescent. Since the no-fly zone was imposed on Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the early 90s, the Kurds have been fairly self-governing and democratic in northern Iraq. But in practice, it's corrupt and tribal, and you have clans there. So, western Kurdistan in northern Iraq, around Erbil, is controlled by the Barzani clan. The eastern part of Iraqi Kurdistan is controlled by the Talabani clan, around Suleiman. And because Erbil is more centralized than Suleiman, you have relatively more prosperity and stability in Erbil than in Suleiman. Kurdistan is very corrupt and poor, although there is some progress. They have progressed quite a lot in the last 30 years, but it's only relatively thriving compared to the rest of Iraq. Next, Robert Kaplan talks about Iran and its imperial tradition, and that the Islamic Revolution in 1979 actually ended through devotion of Islam, of Muslims in Iran, because now you have a corrupt state and bureaucracy fused with political Islam, which Iranians see doesn't work, which makes them more secular even though they're living in a theocracy. Kaplan argues that when writing his book, he's actually seeing the beginnings of a liberal revolution in Iran. So the protests we saw in 2022 is likely the beginning of a new era in Iran soon. And so it's actually possible that Iran will be a liberal democracy soon, Robert Kaplan argues, and this could have a positive influence on the Middle East. And initially this country would be aligned with the United States and the West, but eventually it would be more economically oriented towards China. Then Robert Kaplan talks about Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is an example of how imposed Marxism and democracy has failed, because Afghanistan is still a very tribal society. So the Marxism imposed by the Soviets in the 80s failed. Guerrilla fighters were very effective against them, and then when the United States came and toppled the Taliban in 2001 and they imposed democracy there for 20 years, you had elections, sure, but people were still loyal to their tribes because there was no basis of civil society to make democracy sustainable in Afghanistan. So of course the Taliban returned there in 2021, but now Afghanistan is at the crossroads of an important economic change of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So the prospects of Afghanistan lie with China, which is seeking to make an economic supply chain that goes from Xinjiang down through Afghanistan and then through Pakistan to its ports to the greater Indian Ocean. Robert Kaplan's conclusion in this book is that the best way to have progress in the Middle East is to have consultative autocrats who maintain order, not through democracy that will likely lead to anarchy. So that's the book. So how would I rate The Loom of Time by Robert Kaplan? I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. And it's a good book. It has a lot of great analysis, but it's a bit too deterministic for me in this book. It's more deterministic than Robert Kaplan's Revenge of Geography, for example. And I don't like his cultural relativism in this book, and he over-romanticizes a bit some dictators, kind of. But a lot of good geopolitical analysis of Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and the Fertile Crescent region, and Iran and Afghanistan. As usual, another good book by Robert Kaplan. If you want a good primer on the Greater Middle East region that's up to date, remember this is released a few months ago in 2023, then you should check out The Loom of Time. It doesn't really talk about Israel, so what's happening there now with Gaza and Hamas shouldn't really take away from the quality of this book for now. If you want to learn more about the Greater Middle Eastern geopolitics, then you should definitely check out The Loom of Time by Robert Kaplan. Robert Kaplan is probably my second favorite nonfiction author, so I intend to read and probably review more of his geopolitics books. If you like this video, then you can check out this playlist of other Robert Kaplan book reviews. Otherwise, I'm the avid reader, and I will see you readers next time.